Welcome to a new series called Dead Design. This series covers design trends or products that heavily use design but no longer exist, just like the products I'm going to talk about today. UI design in video game demo discs. So what I like about Dead Design, especially in products like the title in this video, you get a time capsule on what designers thought design was supposed to look like at that time for a product or use case that is by today's standards irrelevant or outdated. But you also have to remember this UI design was built for low resolution 13 to 20 inch TV sets where you're sitting 6 feet away, usually a CRT with only a controller to navigate the UI with a severely underpowered console. And while we're going to go through multiple generations, designers kind of knew what you were going to be using. With the exception of the PS3 and 360, we'll get to why later, you knew when people were going to use CRTs or HDTVs, and you knew how to design for that. So you might see things like huge text or glowing buttons and outlines, but that's because these designers were designing for that specific use case. Right now, we live in a world where we have anything from 23-inch 1080p to 70-inch 4K TVs, ultra-wides to vertical phone displays. Designing an interactive UI, or basically web design, is kind of a nightmare right now. But back then, you kind of knew what people were using. So while this is going to be a fun one, especially for those who love retro games, it's also going to be a hard, in-depth look into UI design in the early 90s to mid-2000s, on how video game companies, retailers, and even magazines translated UI design for demo discs. And while demo discs are all but dead, you can still learn from early UI design and why they designed certain ways. Now, let's get into it. When the PlayStation came out, it used a media that was cheap to produce and had tons of storage on it. Magazines were also a huge market, and store kiosks for video games were nothing new. But if you remember Genesis or Nintendo and store kiosks, they were huge. Literally, you had a jukebox-style demo booth filled with a handful of actual cartridges that were timed by the kiosk itself. Literally, a hard switch resets the game. With CD media, you could put multiple snippets of games inside the actual console. No giant box, no complicated game changer, just a small kiosk stand. And game magazines had another outlet to upsell their publication to you by putting games, videos, and even downloadables into the disc. The compact disc really was a revolution in how you got media. Now you can sample games that haven't even come out yet, or games that never hit the United States. The internet was still pretty new and connection speeds were slow. You really couldn't watch video online, let alone play demos or look at images. So these demo discs were some of the best ways people got media. That said, because the internet was so young and the actual user interface of the devices these things were on, UI and UX design was interesting. What's the difference between UI and UX? UI is the stuff on the screen, like icons, usually graphics or visual designers build this. UX designers kind of flowchart the entire menu design. Sometimes a UX and UI designer are the same person, sometimes they're totally different people, and they collaborate with each other on how the site flows and looks. And all this was key when designing demo discs. Check out these early PS1 demo disc interfaces. Some of these look amazingly similar to what modern day console storefronts and home screens look like, but also, you can see how magazines were trying to translate print layout to digital layout design. I wouldn't be surprised if some of these people went on to build websites or interfaces for apps or even game consoles themselves. Don't forget the design of these interfaces are dictated by where they're living. In-store kiosks, sampler purchase discs, with games as a compilation of coming soon titles, and corporate or magazine promotionals. And you can tell by the design of these discs where they lived. Obviously, a PlayStation Underground disc isn't going to be in a kiosk at Toys R Us, while a bare-bones grid-based demo menu is going to be boring for a magazine company trying to upsell their product. But all of these have one thing in common: menu design. Menu design works best when you don't know you're using a menu. A menu should be easy to use at a glance. You should be able to know exactly what you need to do within 1 to 5 seconds of looking at it, but you want it to have a style, especially when you're trying to capture the attention of kids. First, let's talk about the PC demo scene, because while you might think the PS1 was the beginning of game demos, we had demos way back in the day, even kind of before me with DOS and freeware games on these things. But most of these were straight up text-based UI and maybe a logo or different colors on the text. It wasn't until CD-based storage devices allowing a cheap way to add a ton of content did we get UI-based demo discs. And that started with the PlayStation. PlayStation 1 was one of the more unique consoles designed for. Not only did you just have a controller, sometimes you had a controller without analog sticks. You were also farther away from the screen, which was usually extremely low res, so text needed to be large and UI elements needed to stand out and easy to travel and select. Since you didn't have a mouse, you had to rely on the D-pad to move through different UI elements. What you'll notice very quickly about the UI elements is designers went two very different routes. A more almost modern interface where it's simplistic UI elements with a very quick UX flowchart to a more realistic look, or what I like to call skeuomorphism, with a longer travel time to give you an experience. Now, both work, especially when you think about who these designs are for. Kids who want to play games and are into that hyper raw, rad gaming scene of the 90s. So when a blimp shows up to display games and codes, it's kind of cool, but even then you can see revisions to those disks and interface elements. Instead of pressing a button to flip over an element, the next revision of the disk just shows you the element. You can see the designers are saving time, evolving their design, and creating faster UX. But both of these designs rely on layout. Layout is a huge part of UI and UX design. It affects the way viewers perceive what is important. Obviously, a menu item is going to look more important, with either bolder text, brighter colors, or animated elements letting you know, hey, you should click this. And you can kind of see those elements still used today. Just go to any website with a chatbot and you'll notice a slight animation, or if they want you to click on a button, it might bounce or be a color that isn't anywhere else on the website. Make no mistake, these demo disc designers were using key elements of web design and call to action strategies before it really was a thing. Motion graphic design was a huge deal for these demos. Every designer used motion graphics on these demo discs in one way or another. Some of them might be subtle, but they all use them. What we see as the key elements for web design navigation is exactly the same for these 90s demo discs. For one, they should be responsive, meaning fast and fluid. It shouldn't hinder your experience, rather enhance it. These graphics should have intention, meaning a glowing circle should be a button rather than just a motion graphic, especially if it's prominent on the screen. Not having an actual action might confuse a user. Awareness is a huge part of motion design. Those elements should adaptively respond to the location you're in. Maybe it's a steel looking frame that when you go over it, it either opens or closes an element, but having it disappear rather than act like a physical item may feel weird or out of place. Consistency is a huge thing. If one motion graphic element opens another page, the same graphic should be used throughout. Using different elements to do the same thing can confuse a user on what does what on the disc. Again, these demo disc designers were doing something unlike any other designer was doing at the time, but let's move on to the next generation of consoles. The Dreamcast demo discs are kind of a bridge between design styles. The system came out in a time when the PS1 was still out, but the PS2 was on its way. It was also right in the middle of the web boom, and so design drastically changed. You can see this too on demo disc design. Just look at what the first disc of this series looked like compared to the last one. A total overhaul of the design. And while you could say it's extremely simplistic, compared to what this was and how confusing everything looked, it's like night and day. Now, when you get into the PS2 era, you start to notice simplistic design more 2000-ish looking. And that's because of Web 2.0's new design standard and layout. When these discs came out, the web had been around for quite some time, and designers had learned from past experiences. This is when TVs were starting to change, getting bigger and flatter. You had 480p and 720 displays. So the over-the-top design was kind of fading away because it wasn't necessary anymore. You still had character to these designs, but you can tell there was a shift beginning. Even on the GameCube, the rad 90s design is gone. It's clean. Plus, these are more kiosk discs. These are designed to be in the store, so a bunch of interface and interactivity really isn't ideal for them. I mean, that's why you can see the time limit on each. They want you to try it, get your fill, and go hopefully buy a game. But even the original Xbox was tame compared to the original PlayStation. Even with their on-brand green goo background, you can see the design language of the time. Skeuomorphism, bezels, and the aqua style Apple famously started. This was also the beginning of console UI. While considered extremely bare bones by today's standards, each console had its own UI and UX elements built into it. And these new demo discs kind of follow that design somewhat, especially with the Xbox. When you get into the PS3 and 360 era, demo discs were starting to be non-existent. That's simply because of the online stores and downloadable demos. Now, you didn't need demo discs. UI elements were well into Web 2.0, console interfaces had their own identity with specific UI and UX elements, and you can kind of see that with the 360 demo discs. While the interface of the console has updated through the years, this design mimics that of the original Blade design of the 360, and you can see it relies on the console to play the games rather than the disc. That more so with the PS3 actually installing onto the console, rendering the discs kind of useless. But again, like the Xbox and PS2 discs, these designers kind of had a restraint to follow the design language of the console itself, because users were so familiar with these interfaces, trying to reinvent the wheel would confuse those users. You couldn't just come up with your own interface anymore, you needed to stay on brand. The other problem with demo discs on the PS3 and 360 was these were bridge devices much like the Dreamcast, but bridges for HD TVs. Both these consoles worked on HDTV and standard def CRTs, but not always at the same time. Look at Dead Rising, which famously didn't really work well on CRTs because you couldn't read the text. For the first time, UI designers needed to be conscious of both resolutions and screen sizes. Welcome to my world. This brings us to the last generation of gaming, and a somewhat unceremonial death to the demo disc scene. What essentially started on the PlayStation 1 is all but dead on the PS4, with the latest demo disc being a VR compilation disc. It needs to download updates and install to work, and while the interface is designed for a completely new platform and controller style, any character or uniqueness is gone, and the requirements of the disc is questionable. It would have just been easier to find those demos on the PlayStation Store. This was the death of the demo disc scene. Though one could say it was dead long before this, with most game magazines moving online and internet speeds pretty good for the majority of people, these discs are no longer needed. But I don't think these designers get the credit they deserve. They were pioneers. They kind of helped how this generation of console interfaces was created. You can't tell me console UI and UX designers didn't take note from these old demo discs, didn't learn from the flowcharts and motion graphics, how games are presented in menus and drill down navigation started with these demo discs. These UI and UX designers on early PlayStation Underground discs, their designs, their heritage lives on in these new interfaces. And I guess you can say this type of a designer and style of design never died, it just evolved. Because this video wasn't about the demo disc scene itself, it was about the design of those demo discs, and that original design, that original structure, lives on in modern day consoles, TVs, media sticks, and even app design. Who's to say these designers weren't the forefathers of modern day UI and UX design for everything we have right now? And with that thought, what do you guys think of demo disc interface design? Do you remember playing these in a Walmart, getting a PlayStation Underground magazine just to drop in the disc to see the latest demos, or did you miss this scene altogether? Let me know in the comments, and until next time, I'll catch you guys all later.